So welcome back to our rapid game series where win, lose or draw we will have a look afterwards in the analysis, and I'll also play through the moves with you and talk you through while we're playing. So here we have the move pawn to d4, knight f6. We'll go for the move pawn to c4 as usual, e6. So we can go straight into a nimzo with the move knight c3 here, or we can play the move knight to f3. Let's go knight f3, pawn to d5. Okay, so we have a lot of different options here. Let's try the move bishop to g5 this time. We haven't tried this one yet. So this one's a pretty good alternative for those of you who want to avoid those lines of knight to c3. So pawn takes. So this goes into like a Vienna, I believe. So we can play the move knight to c3 here. That would just transpose back into one of the main lines. So we don't really want to do that. Let's try to play something different. There's e4. This leads to pretty sharp variations. e3. He's going to play the move pawn to b5. We can also sacrifice this pawn and play it like a Catalan and play like g3, bishop g2. That's also an option. Or we can win the pawn back. The problem with winning the pawn back is he's probably just going to play bishop d7 and bishop to c6. Okay, so I'm just going to sacrifice the pawn. Just going to play the move queen to c2. Go for this. If he plays the move pawn to b5, I'm going to play the move pawn to a4. So he plays knight c6. This is... it doesn't feel that critical of a move. So if I play e3, he plays the move pawn to b5, but then maybe I can play a4. Knight to b4. Or just take the pawn back. Just play it simple. Take the pawn. Yeah, he's going to go queen d5 and try to trade queens, of course. This removes a lot of the pressure from his position. So if we take it, he has to take it back with the knight because he can't allow us to damage his pawn structure. So there we go for this. Knight takes, we play a3 to stop the knight from coming to b4. And then we can follow through with the move pawn to e4 and then knight to c3 just to develop the rest of our pieces. So the queens are off the board, but he definitely still has a few problems, like with his light squared bishop. And the knight on c6 isn't the best square because it blocks the c pawn. This move is strategically quite weakening for his dark squares later on. His obvious idea is to trap my bishop, so he wants to go h6, g5. Like when my bishop comes back this way, but my bishop can also come this way as well if I wanted to. So it's not the end of the world. But e3, h6, bishop back, g5, bishop to g3. If he plays the move pawn to f4 there, it's probably fine for me actually. I can also just drop the bishop back here and then play knight to c3. And then recapture with the bishop, maintaining control over c3. Or I can play e3, drop the bishop back here, play knight to d2, rook c1, knight c4, try to bring the knight into the e5 square. So yeah, somehow don't really want to allow this f4 idea though, because things get quite messy afterwards. So I'm just going to play bishop d2, play the move knight to c3, keep things simple. Okay, so we play knight c3. Okay, castles. So we can take the knight here and then position our bishop on f4, which is going to be a better square overall than where it's currently at. It might free up his bishop, but I think it's okay because on f4 you can play like rook c1. If he plays h6, you can play h4 to try and cement the bishop on this f4 square. The other option is just playing e3, rook c1, and then leaving his bishop stuck behind the e6 pawn, but yeah, I somehow think that this is better. At least it's a little bit simpler, because now I play bishop to f4. Stops bishop d6, I play e3, bring the bishop out, rook across, and h4. I also have these sort of weaknesses I can still play against. So I can play h5 and just fix the pawns if I want to. It might be a good idea to do that. Yeah, this way he can't move any of his pawns on the king side. Whenever the knight moves from c6, then I always have knight e5. But now, yeah, there's no more counterplay left on the king side for black. And this is good for me now because I can focus my attention more on the queen side. So I'm expecting him to maybe play rook e8 or the other rook to e8 to threaten knight takes d4 here and winning a pawn because of the pin along the e file. In which case I probably will play rook c1. You can directly defend the pawn, but you always want to look for moves where your pieces get to better squares. So that would be rook c1 would be better move than say rook to d1, which directly defends the pawn. Whereas the move rook to c1 sort of indirectly defends the pawn, but it puts my rook on a better square. And it also ties his knight down, so now the knight can't move. It's sort of stuck defending c7. So if he takes, I have rook takes c7. And then afterwards I have discoveries when I move the rook. So now I'm free to move the rook next move. I move the king next move. So I can play king to d2 if I want. Ideally I want to play b4, put the king on d2, bishop to d3, maybe bring the rook up to c5 and like double rooks. Yeah, so the king goes across. So now we can play the move king to d2 here. Knight a5 isn't a problem yet because bishop takes pawn. So I'm going to do that. It also removes the threat of knight takes d4. Okay, so now he's defended against the threat of knight takes d4. Against the threat of bishop takes c7, sorry. So if rook c5, attacking the pawn, maybe he plays b6, rook takes, bishop to e6. Our rook might be trapped there, so I'm not 100% sure I want to go into that. I could play the move rook to b5. It's probably okay actually, like the rook might survive, but it looks very messy. So I have to calculate it out to be 100% sure if you go for a line like rook c5. So b6, rook takes d5, bishop to e6, rook to b5, and the rook has no squares to go to after that, but he can't immediately trap it with a6 because rook takes b6 check and you have the pin, but maybe he just plays a quiet move like king b7, and I don't want to really allow this sort of option. What else can we do? We can play bishop b5 first, so then he can't move the knight because the bishop is always hanging. So we're trying to stop knight a5 basically. Looking for moves which stop knight a5. Maybe the easiest one is just b4. Yeah, I'm just going to go b4. Stops knight a5. Relatively simple move. Then I just play the move bishop to d3 and then rook c5. So what can black do? Maybe a6? If a6, I have a lot of options there. So it goes for rook e7. Okay, so bishop d3. Next we play rook c5 and then double rooks. Or rook c3 and double rooks is also looks promising. I also have ideas here of kicking the knight away and then getting the e5 square. So as soon as I chase the knight away, then I can think about posting one of these pieces into the e5 square. With the bishop on d3 attacking the f5 pawn, also it means that my h5 pawn is not under any immediate danger, which is also good. Now after the move bishop to e6, I can play rook c5 because b6 is no longer an option. Also ties a lot of black's pieces down. So after rook c5 now can't chase me away, so then I can double rooks with rook c1. Yeah, knight to d8. I think I just double rooks. All of black's pieces are tied down. Many of them cannot move. So if I go here, b6 is probably the best bet. Or I can immediately try to bring the knight into e5. That's another option. Looks promising as well. He's gonna play knight to f7 next. So maybe I just win the bishop while I still can, because after knight f7 I can't play knight e5 anymore. Yeah, I'll play knight e5 because yeah, otherwise I won't get another chance to play it. I also like the fact that after knight e5 bishop takes knight f7 is not an option, because then I have bishop takes g7 and yeah, rook g8 is met by just bishop f6. So after this I just double rooks. Now I feel like I have a very sizable advantage because of the two bishops, and especially the dark squared bishop here is very strong. So I should play this move, I think. Put pressure. And then I just take. Force him to make a decision. So his pieces are stuck defending a lot here. So it's quite difficult to find a move. And black just resigns here. I think yeah, it's difficult to find a move in this position. There's quite a big advantage. If you can't go knight takes because of the pawn, can't go bishop takes because of the pawn. Yeah, pawn takes rook b1 is quite strong. And yeah, the bishop's gonna come to a6 next with a big advantage. Okay, let's go back to the start of the game and have a check. Okay, so yeah, the main move is queen to a4 according to this database. On Lee Chess, a lot of different moves have been played. So yeah, queen c2 is actually not played that often. Yeah, I thought the critical move is definitely b5 here. But yeah, after the move pawn to a4, pawn to c6, g3, we're probably transposing back to a line of like the Catalan where black is a pawn up, but white has some compensation there. But yeah, if you don't like that, you could also just go queen a4 or pawn to e3 is all relatively safe options. But after this option, I thought we were relatively okay here. Actually, the computer wants to play e4. Bishop check. And knight to d2. So this would have also been quite good. I think white is doing fine here. But in the game, a3, h6. Yeah, so takes was fine. And h4 plan. Yeah, I felt like as soon as we got in h5, then white definitely has a clear advantage there, because then black doesn't have any more counterplay we need to worry about, and we're sort of free to exercise our play on the queen side. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this game. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you on the next game.